Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Congregation Beth Ahm. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Howard Lupovitch. I'm going to be our lecturer for this series. I see many, many familiar faces. I see some some less familiar faces. Welcome to everyone. So let me say first, before I start, that I think it's been about 2.5 years since I did a community lecture in person as opposed to on Zoom. So I think first let's acknowledge it's very nice to be back. I was thinking about, I taught at Wayne all year in person, but I was masked the whole time, and I've done things in public mask, but this is thankfully, we can be unmasked. At least we have the option of being unmasked, and in person it's nice. And I was thinking about the difference between doing this on Zoom and doing this in person is, well, when I was masked, I had to be fully dressed, but I didn't have to shave. But on Zoom, I had to shave, but I only had to be dressed from the waist up. So, but now we're back to I have to be both shaven and wearing pants, and that's a really good thing. A step back towards normal. So hopefully things will continue in this direction. The point is, it's very nice to be here with you in person. All right. Also, sometimes when I speak at Beth Ahm, I forget to thank our hosts here partly because, as many of you know, I feel very at home here. This is where I go to shul. I read Torah from this spot right here. Hopefully I won't get confused and start just reciting the Torah reading. But because of that, sometimes I forget to, when you're in a place that's very familiar, you forget to sort of thank you. So I think I want to start by thanking David Goodman and Congregation Beth Ahm for hosting this lecture. It's always this series. It's always a pleasure for me to speak to Beth Ahm. My home away from home. And I don't want to step on any toes, but if you're looking to join a new synagogue, I can guarantee you this is a great place. You should seriously think about it. Nothing against any other congregation in the area, but if you're thinking about it, think about it. And this is one of the perks, I guess. You don't have to be a member, but this is it's a nice place to be. So, in this series, we're going to talk about an aspect of Jewish culture, of Jewish life, of Jewish history, of the Jewish story that we don't normally talk about. Talking about Jews who were spies is not a topic we typically talk about in a series like this. I mean, think about it. Think of the other series and classes you attend. Usually it's about something related to, something about Judaism, maybe something about Jewish literature, maybe something about Jewish philosophy or thought, something about Israel, something about anti-Semitism. But here, we're talking about something it's maybe a little bit more unusual, a little exotic. This little, very specific category of Jews who were spies. So right from the get-go, before I dive into our specific topic for tonight, let me just say a couple general things about the category of Jews as spies. Incidentally, parenthetically, for those of you who are not familiar with how it works with when I'm speaking, usually I do my spiel and I leave questions. We'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have a question, make a mental note and we'll have time to ask it at the end. So the general category of Jews as spies, I was thinking about it, and it occurred to me the following. First of all, by definition, a Jew who is a spy is a highly exceptional and atypical individual, because I'm going to go on a limb and say most of us are not spies. I've never been a spy. Mind you, I do have a close friend who, our little circle of friends, we're pretty sure he is a spy, but for years, 20 or 30 years, we've thought he was a spy, and he might be a spy, but I don't know. The point is, if you know someone who actually is a spy, you probably wouldn't know for sure. But most of us have never been spies. So on the one hand, a Jewish spy is a highly atypical individual because most of us are not. On the other hand, one of the things we're going to see from this series is that the individuals we're going to talk about, apart from the fact that they were spies, they really weren't that different from others. And that is one of the signature features of a successful spy, at least as far as I know. Of course, my knowledge is only secondhand because I've never been a spy. But one of the signature characteristics is, you have to be good at spying, you have to be good at deception, but you also have to have the ability to blend in. It's unusual that someone who is highly conspicuous, highly noticeable, someone constantly drawing attention to themselves, that person will probably not be a very good spy because everyone's looking at them all the time. A spy, by definition, has to blend in. So there has to be a level of normalcy, or at least ordinariness, to a spy. Now, alongside that, to be a spy, you have to have certain abilities that most of us, I think, don't have. We all engage. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say at some point we've all engaged in acts of deception. We all do it. We don't. We do it. It's just it's human nature. But I don't think we do it as professionally and meticulously and deliberately as a spy does. It is an act of deception. You have to convince a group of people, a government, somebody that you are something that you are not. And you have to do it maybe in a situation which is dangerous, maybe in a situation which is tense. You just have to be able to do it in a very nonchalant and inconspicuous way. So one thing you'll see in this series is that the Jewish spies we're going to look at in this series, on one hand, they're really remarkable and exceptional individuals, but on the other hand, they're a lot like ordinary people. You will find that you share in common, each one of us shares in common some of the attributes, some of the personality of each of the individuals we're going to deal with in this series. So that's just putting it in sort of general terms. One last element, and I think it's something unique to the question of Jewish spies, is when, the minute we talk about the category of Jewish spies, it immediately calls to mind a larger stereotype, I should say a larger negative stereotype or anti-Semitic stereotype about Jews, and that is that Jews are, from an anti-Semitic point of view, Jews are inherently disloyal, Jews are inherently deceptive, and this goes back a long way. I mean, the original conspiracy theory about Jews, and one of the original conspiracy theories in the world, is the notion that Jews were the undercover agents of Satan. That is a very old theory. Now, we wouldn't say that Christians believed Jews were Satan's spies, but the way, especially in the Christian imagination, Jews were described or Jews were regarded is not entirely different the way today we would describe someone who is spying on our country on behalf of another country. There's a sort of covertness. That's not only deceptive, there's something almost demonic about it. So when we talk about, one of the things we will talk about to greater or lesser degree for each of our 4 sessions is how this notion, or how an individual Jewish spy, how does that resonate with this broader notion of Jews being disloyal, of Jews somehow being unpatriotic, Jews being cosmopolitan and rootless and serving a foreign government. Now, we're not going to talk about that as much tonight as we are in the coming sessions, although we will talk about it a little. Okay. So with those general observations in mind, let's dive into the topic tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about a very interesting character that in some ways is very familiar to many of us, but in some ways not entirely familiar. And this is a Jew whose name was Mo Berg. Mo Berg, of course, he's the short version of Mo Berg, born Morris Berg. The short version of him is he is the child of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe early in the 20th century, born in Brooklyn, moved to New Jersey, moved outside of Newark as a small child. He loved baseball, he was really good in school, and he in high school he played baseball. And remarkably, he also graduated from an Ivy League institution, both as an undergraduate and as a law student, which was highly unusual. He had a Major League Baseball career, which is highly, highly unusual at the time. The truth is, it's not that typical even now. And then as an adult, he went from being Major League Baseball player to being a spy on behalf of the OSS, which of course was the precursor of the CIA. That's the short version of his story. He did all of those things. But let's pause and let's go into a little more depth here, because in some ways these different strands, these different elements of his story are separate. We can compartmentalize them, but they do kind of fit together, and they do kind of complement one another. And this is what I mean by saying, in some ways, he wasn't the only Jew to go to college. He wasn't the only Jew who loved to play sports. He wasn't the only Jew in the military or even in the intelligence community. But the fact that he did all of those things at once is really remarkable. Let's talk a little bit more about who he was. So like I said, his parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. His father was a lower middle class guy. He grew up in a neighborhood of Brooklyn. As a child, his father moved the business across the river to Newark. That is a standard Jewish immigrant story. The Jewish community in and around Newark, sociologists of the American Jewish community call that a secondary Jewish settlement. It isn't where that many Jews settled right when they got off the boat, right from Ellis Island, although some did. But it is the place, it was the destination where there were many Jews who, after they settled on the Lower East Side or somewhere in Lower Manhattan and got established a little bit, that's one of the places when they left the immigrant neighborhood, that's one of the places where they went. Growing up, it's interesting about him because when he described his own life growing up, they didn't do very much that was very Jewish. We would describe him, if we really wanted to sort of, in simplistic terms, we would call him an assimilated Jew. He didn't do very much. Wasn't big on going to synagogue. His mother was more religious than his father. They both inherited certain traditions, certain family customs from the old country. They did a little stuff, not a lot. But at the same time, and I think this is something very telling of that generation, in some ways it's something very telling of our own, is that even though he didn't do very much which was Jewish, he was always proud to be Jewish. And proud to be Jewish is something we really can't underestimate, neither when we talk specifically about Mo Berg, nor broadly about Jewish identity generally. Just as an aside, just to give you what I think is the significance of the phrase "proud to be Jewish," the Pew Center today has done these studies of the identity of American Jews. They did it in 2010 and a couple times, and the results are always abysmal. Outside the Orthodox community, Jews do nothing. Very few Jews keep kosher and go to synagogue, and more Jews are intermarrying or having a Jewish education, and the list goes on, and all that is something that, something worrisome that we have to deal with. But for me, the question from the Pew Report that stands out the most telling question is, are you proud to be Jewish? And in 2010, in the American Jewish community, across the American Jewish community, 94% of Jews said yes, they're still proud to be Jewish. So it's not the most complete and all-encompassing Jewish life, but proud to be Jewish is and has always really meant something. And a century ago, Mo Berg fell squarely into the category of proud to be Jewish. Now, we'll put a pin in that for a second, because when we talk about his transition from the major leagues into the intelligence community, proud to be Jewish is going to be part of that. Okay. But growing up, like many American Jews, like most American Jews, and certainly like the children of the immigrants who arrived from Eastern Europe, one of the things they wanted to do, indeed, many of the immigrants themselves, if there was one singular goal they had upon arriving in America, it was becoming Americanized. The one thing immigrants wanted to do was to be American. They saw the opportunity. Clearly the decision to leave the old country was never easy, but they saw possibilities in America that were now available, and they wanted to embrace them, and they wanted to be American. Now, this didn't only mean being seen as American or accepted as American, which was certainly part of it, but they wanted to feel like Americans. You know, it was one of the things that there was a study done of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe when they arrived in America. One of the first things they did when they had the ability to do it, before they could speak English, before they had a steady job, is what they would do is that as soon as they had enough money to buy some American clothes, they would take a family photograph dressed in American clothes and send it back to the family in Eastern Europe. Before they were even actually American, they wanted to show the people who were still in Europe were on the path to becoming American. That's what they wanted to do. Now, if that was the goal, if that was the most prominent goal of American Jews, well, Mo Berg and his family were very good at it. When they left Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn to move to New Jersey, they settled in a neighborhood where certainly there were Jews, but it wasn't a very Jewish neighborhood. They lived not in Newark and not in the Jewish neighborhood of Newark. They lived outside of Newark where there were some Jews, but not many. Now, as a child, like many of his generation, Morris Berg, who is now becoming Mo Berg, he had a strong affinity for two things. He was an excellent student who had a real affinity for and a gift for studying foreign languages, and he loved sports, and especially he loved baseball. This was also something very common about that generation. Because apart from taking the family picture in the American clothes, even before they could speak English, this generation of immigrants became sports fans. If you lived in New York, even before you could speak the language, you were a fan typically of the New York Giants because of where they were. You know, the Yankees, because they were in the Bronx, and part of the Bronx where there weren't that many Jews, and the Yankees were a little more, a little waspier. They tended to be their fan base tended to be a little whiter, a little less ethnic. The immigrants tended toward the New York Giants for a variety of reasons. But everyone, young people, they played baseball or stickball, some version. And of course, they all aspired to be a baseball player. Now remember, this is a point where the New York Giants and the New York Yankees, these were two of the best teams in the major leagues. Yankees, of course, we know. Murderers Row, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig. By the time you get to the 1920s and the 1930s, that's what every kid wanted to be, especially every boy. You want to be a baseball player. Oh, I want to play in the major leagues. Obviously, most of them didn't have the ability to do it. Most of them could sort of play in a pickup game or a sandlot game or maybe a youth league or something like that. But Mo Berg could really play. And when he got to high school, he came and tried out for the team. Now, something very interesting, when he came to try out for the team, there weren't any Jews on the team. There was this prevailing stereotype about Jews, that Jews were not athletic. Jews are bookish. Jews are more cerebral. Jews are good in school, and Jews go on to be, accountants and dentists and things like that. But baseball, that's not something for Jews. And when he first played baseball, he didn't play baseball under the name Mo Berg. He made up a name for himself. He played under the pseudonym Runt Wolf. Wolf spelled W-O-L-F-E. He used that spelling of Wolf, which is a little less Jewish looking. He didn't want at the start anyone to know he was Jewish until he proved himself on the field, which he did right away. And in high school, he played a number of different positions, but he played shortstop, he played first base, but his high school team was very successful. And he was an important part of that. He was one of the top two hitters on his team. He was the best defensive player. Defense would be his forte through his whole baseball career. But he did well enough that when it was time to graduate high school, he had a reasonable expectation that he could succeed both as a ball player and as a student. Now you have to imagine from his parents' point of view, from his parents' generation, every kid who was born was enrolled in college that day, and maybe enrolled in law school and medical school that day. That was the expectation. That was the goal. Remember, for that generation that came to America, who came as adults from the old country, they worked like crazy. This is the Sweatshop Generation or the pushcart generation. They worked tirelessly. Not only to just basically support themselves, but one of their goals is that their children wouldn't have to work at a young age and they would be able to go to school. And initially, the goal was to graduate high school. That was part of this path to becoming American. But really, the brass ring, the top of the mountain, was going to college. Remember, in Eastern Europe, the possibility of going to college, going to university, was very remote. Because even if you had the means and the ability and the interest to do it, the options in Eastern Europe were it was a big choice to go to the university in Warsaw. It meant you were going into a very different world. But in America, this was a place where, at least theoretically, it was more meritocracy. If you were good enough, you could do it. So he had these two aspirations, baseball and college, but his parents basically, you're going to college. And he did. And he didn't just go to college. Initially, he was accepted to NYU, which, believe it or not, in those days, there weren't that many Jews who went to NYU. The overwhelming majority of Jews from that generation went to City College and schools like City College. There were those kind of urban campuses in other cities as well. There's City College in New York. There was Drexel in Philadelphia. That's where the children of Jewish immigrants tended to go. NYU was unusual. Now, I know that seems counterintuitive today, because today there are a lot of Jewish undergraduates at NYU, very different a century ago. And he was successful at NYU, good enough that after a couple of years he was able to transfer. He was accepted to Princeton University. And it wasn't just that he was smart enough to get into the best school. Just being Jewish and getting into Princeton University, circa 1920, was extremely difficult. This is the age when the Ivy Leagues were not only, it wasn't just sort of a vague reluctance to accept Jews. They had specific quotas on how many Jews would be admitted each year. And somehow they were able to evade that sort of First Amendment separation of religion and state, where you can't explicitly ask someone to be Jewish. They found ways to do it. Long story short, also say parenthetically, their quota system never really worked because it was poorly designed. In order to avoid claims of discrimination, what most of the Ivies would do is they couldn't say, we're going to have a quota on Jewish students, but they're going to say, we're only going to accept a certain number of students from the greater New York area. That was part of it. That's one way to limit the number without saying the word Jew. But they also said, we're going to be sure to admit every year at least one student from small towns across America. So they allotted a lot of spots for Des Moines, Iowa, and Peoria, Illinois, and Cheyenne, Wyoming. You get the idea. Small towns across America, on the assumption that all of these spots would be filled by Christian students, because there aren't any Jews there. But what wound up happening increasingly during the 20s and especially in the 30s and 40s is that the one student who applied from Des Moines, Iowa would be Jewish. And of course, because there was a spot reserved for him, he got in. And so in some cases, this quota system actually wound up leading to more Jewish students being admitted to these universities. And I would have loved to have been in the room when the admissions people and the regents of the university are shaking their heads going, why are there more and more Jewish students showing up every year when we're trying for less and less? In any case, Mo Berg did not get in because of a quota system. He got in because he was a really gifted student. And he graduated from Princeton University magna cum laude, which means with high honors. So he wasn't summa cum laude, the highest. He was second tier honors, second highest, magna cum laude. But magna cum laude from Princeton University, that's no small achievement. He majored in languages. You hear about him. Some say he could speak 7 languages. Some say he could speak 12 languages. Some say he could speak 17 languages. And different biographies of him, they'll list all the languages. The truth is, as time went on, he learned more and more languages. Some of them he learned apparently even after he was dead. The number keeps getting bigger and bigger, but the specific number doesn't matter. Because if you get to 7 languages or some number like that, that's a lot of work. Trust me, it's a lot of work to learn that many languages, and if you can do it, especially if you can do it as easily as he did, and he wasn't learning, seven related languages. He wasn't learning, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, French, Latin. No, he knew Sanskrit and Japanese and European languages. I mean, these were languages spread across the globe. He had a real knack and ear for language. He was really, really good at it. Now, as he's completing Princeton University, this is also his chance to begin to pursue his baseball career as well. And so he begins to pursue his other dream as well. It's one of the parts of his story that most young people, they'll have these dreams, they'll have these goals, they don't always get to realize all of them. He actually managed to do it, and he did it of his own gifts and his own abilities. So, if you look at your handout, I gave us a little timeline. Okay, so when he began playing semi-professional baseball, college baseball, when he was at NYU. At Princeton, while he was graduating magna cum laude and majoring in modern languages, he also batted .337. What he was most proud of is Princeton's two rival schools were Harvard and Yale, and he batted over 600 in those games. In the rivalry games is when he was absolutely at his best. But even though he was a very good hitter, he was known for his defense. When he would play catcher, he had a cannon of an arm to throw someone out at second. To play shortstop means you have to move very quickly, but also make the throw from awkward positions. That's really these are skill positions. In other words, he wasn't playing the easy positions or the easier positions. He played the skill positions. In 1923, after completing college, he signed a contract with the Brooklyn Robins. Now the Brooklyn Robins became the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1932. But this was a major league ball club. When he got to the majors, going up from the college level up to the majors, especially when he went from the minors to the majors, this is when he began to discover the limits of his ability as a ball player. He could hit. He hit pretty well some of the time. To put it very mildly, and this is a pretty common story, he had trouble hitting a major league curveball. He could hit a fastball, but he couldn't hit a curveball. He tended to swing at pitches out of the strike zone. I don't think we need to get too much into the nitty-gritty of his game, but he was a good hitter. But during his career in the majors, where he played for a number of different teams, he was a lifetime. His batting average was average. Really the mark is 300. He never came clean. He didn't hit 300 in a career, although he did manage to do it in a couple of seasons. He was a mid-200 sort of hitter, which means someone who can stay in the majors, but only if they're good at other things. And for him, it was his fielding, it was his arm that kept him in the majors for a long time. Okay, he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Later, he signed with the Chicago White Sox. Now, in 1926, and this must have made his parents very happy, he was still playing Major League Baseball. He decided to go back to school. He went to Columbia Law School. So he not only got into Princeton as an undergrad, he got into Columbia Law School, which wasn't just difficult generally, but it was extra difficult for someone who's Jewish to get into Columbia Law School in 1926. The percentage of Jews in the law school, although it was higher than it had been before, it was maybe 15%. It was still pretty low. And you know how it was in those days. Many of the students who got accepted, if you had a little connection, if you grew up in New York City and your parents or you had some connection with the university, it helped more in those days, I think, at least theoretically, than that does now. In any case, he went to law school. While he was in law school, he continued to play baseball, but he had to start to choose between the two. So, the winter semester went all the way until late April. Spring training began in April or March. So he would arrive with the team late, a month late, 6 weeks late. That isn't just getting there late. he didn't really start getting in shape and really start training. He was usually 6 weeks behind the rest of the team. And so his season stats often reflected the fact that he was spending the first month and a half of each season getting back into shape, getting his timing back. And that's one of the things that pulled all his numbers down. He was determined to do both. But he did graduate from Columbia Law School in 1930. In 1931, you can see, he signed with the Indians, he played for the Washington Senators. The fact that he played for all of these teams, that's usually a sign where he was a decent ball player, he was good enough to play in the majors, but he wasn't good enough for one team to hold on to him for a whole career. He signed short-term contracts, and when the contracts ran out, sometimes he was re-signed, sometimes he wasn't. More than anything else, he was playing year to year in the major leagues. Now that wasn't that typical. That unusual. In those days, many ball players, all but the real stars, were playing short-term contracts, were year to year. This was long before the age of free agency or anything like that. Ball players were entirely at the disposal of the owners of the team, not only in terms of whether they got traded or re-signed, but even the salaries were dictated by the owners. Players had almost no leverage in terms of negotiating a salary. I mean, look, unless you were Babe Ruth, then you had some leverage, but there were maybe 5 or 6 players like that altogether. Most players, even if they had some real talent, unless they were superstars, they were playing on short-term contracts. It wasn't seen as being a great career. Most ball players, probably until the 1940s or maybe the 1950s, they didn't make enough money such so that they didn't need another job in the off-season to support themselves. Most ball players, the season would end and they would go back home and work in the store or find some other way to supplement their income. And Moberg was no different in this regard. Okay, but one of the things he did do is that in the off season after the 1932 season, this is one of those sort of signature turning points of his life in terms of his transition from being part of the major leagues to being in the intelligence world. In 1932. During the off-season, after the season ended, he joined a number of other major league players who were sent to Japan on a kind of, a PR mission for Major League Baseball. This is the point where Major League Baseball was trying to cultivate an interest and an audience outside the United States, and Japan was one of the first countries that was interested in learning this American sport of baseball. And so Moberg accompanied a few other ball players, and they went to Japan, and they gave seminars, really exhibitions, about how to play baseball at a number of Japanese universities. One in Tokyo and a couple of other places. Now the fact that it was 1932 was not entirely incidental here. Because remember, by 1932, this is the moment when Japan is beginning to emerge as a world power. If it had been 10 or 20 years earlier, Japan was certainly a country and a force to be reckoned with, but China was the great power in the region. But by the 1930s, this is when Japan, began to have these expansionist aspirations. Not long after Moberg was there, this is when Japan would occupy the provinces of Manchuria, which were part of mainland China. Japan was beginning to expand, and Japan was beginning to demonstrate these interests in the Pacific, and of course the United States also had territorial interests and territories in the Pacific. The United States had a close connection with the Philippines and Guam and, of course, Hawaii. And so there was a concern about the American government, on the part of the American government, about Japanese expansionist interests in Southeast Asia and along the Pacific Rim. Now, in 1932, this wasn't yet connected with the fact that Moberg and these ball players were sent there. But by the time we get to 1934, by 2 years later, when the United States government is more concerned about Japan, and Japan is getting more aggressive, this is the point where the American government begins to contemplate the possibility of using Americans who are traveling abroad for one reason or another. Maybe something diplomatic, maybe something educational, and taking advantage of the fact that they have access to a country like Japan. And remember, Japan was still a relatively closed society in 1934. Even after Japan opened itself up to the world, the Japanese people were deeply suspicious of anyone who was not Japanese. There were a lot of travelers and tourists who came to Japan, but if you were there, you were seen very conspicuously as an outsider, and native Japanese people tended not to trust outsiders. And so it was difficult for a country like the United States, which wanted to have some kind of infiltration or make inroads or get inside the mind of the Japanese government. It was difficult because there was this general suspicion there. But after 1932, the seminars that Mo Berg and these other ball players gave, they were very successful. They were very popular. Among young people in Japan especially, they'd never heard of baseball before. And just imagine if you've played other sports, and then you never heard of baseball, and someone introduces you to baseball for the first time. I mean, wow. If you've ever had the feeling of, hitting that ball right on the end of the bat, right on the heart of the bat, how good that would feel. Throwing, catching. The game can be very exciting when it's not long and boring. And so there are a lot of young people who got very excited. The point being that American baseball players were in general were very much welcome. And so in 1934, it wasn't just a couple of random baseball players who were sent to Japan to teach exhibitions. By 1924, baseball had become popular enough that the major leagues, they dispatched a group of major league all-stars. They didn't just send a few players, they sent their best players. They sent a group to Japan that included Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Earl Averill, our own Charlie Gehringer, Jimmy Fox, Lefty Gomez. But what's very interesting, and these were all the best pitchers and hitters, best players in the league, the most high-profile players. And what's unusual, or seeming a little odd, is along with this group sent to Japan was also Mo Berg. Mo Berg went with them. Now that has to give us a little pause, only because we know what happens next in the story. We know at some point Mo Berg is going to make a transition from just being a ball player to being a ball player who's also working for the intelligence community. And because we have that sort of hindsight in mind, biographers of Mo Berg at this point, they ask the question, wait a minute, you have this list of all-stars. You have Jimmy Fox and Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Mo Berg. In terms of pure baseball talent, what is he doing there? He just doesn't kind of doesn't fit in. It's like if the United States, the dream team included not only Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, but also some lesser end of the bench or lesser player. Mo Berg is kind of the sore thumb in that group. Now, yes, he was very good at defense and he was very good at that, but he wasn't the same caliber as these other players. And the notion is, and this is where among his biographers we get into the realm of debate and speculation, they're saying that at this is the point where that he was sent because of his command of the language. He could speak the language fluently because of his own savvy. He wasn't sent only for his baseball ability. He was sent to kind of get a sense of what Japanese people are thinking. He could go talk to people on the street in their own language because he was one of relatively few Americans that was not of Japanese origin who could speak Japanese fluently. He might be able to penetrate a Japanese society that was suspicious of outsiders more easily. So the notion is, as early as 1934, Mo Berg is on not only a diplomatic mission as a cooperative venture between Major League Baseball and the American government, but he's also on an intelligence mission as well. Now, this is speculation. There's no evidence, there's no document which says that in 1934 he was working for the government in any way. But the consensus is this was done in a kind of unofficial way. someone from the American government came to him and said, look, while you're there as part of this baseball exhibition thing, you know, if you want to snap a few pictures, if you want to ask a few questions, and report back to us what these Japanese people are thinking, and if you can have some conversations with government officials or people of influence and interest, and you can get some information out of them, that would be great. So if we want to think about his career in the intelligence community, officially it didn't start until a little bit later. But in 1934, maybe it started unofficially. Unofficially, he's certainly moving in that direction. Okay. Now, when the war breaks out, the war breaks out in 1939, but with respect to East Asia, obviously Pearl Harbor Day, 1941. Now even before December 7th, 1941, the United States was anticipating at least the possibility of war with Japan. They weren't prepared for it, but they were anticipating the possibility. But for our story, for Mo Berg, the attack on Pearl Harbor affected him deeply. It affected him deeply, not only personally because of his own. He felt badly for the victims. He didn't like war, but by this point, he is someone who felt he had a deep love of country. His journey of becoming more American, in many ways, it reached its final step when the war broke out. Because by this point, by 1941 or 1942, think of the lines, think of the doors he's crossed through to become more American. He's entered the elite American educational institutions. He's entered Major League Baseball. These are two pillars of what it means to be an American. And really, during the Second World War, he's going to reach the third of this triad of being truly American. He is willing to fight and die for his country. He wants to be part of the war effort. He goes to volunteer. Now, soon after he volunteers, he is recruited into the intelligence community. They saw what they saw in Mo Berg. First of all, they recognized he probably would have made a good soldier. Certainly, he had the guts, he had the brains, but he'd already been to Japan twice. He was someone who had contacts there. He knew people, and he could speak the language, as he could speak other languages as well. And so he was sent to Japan again, and this time toward the beginning of the war between the United States and Japan. This time he was sent again to Tokyo, ostensibly on some kind of diplomatic mission, but at this time he's doing some actual intelligence work. He's standing on the top of a building in Tokyo with a camera taking pictures of what the city looks like, of what the city's fortifications, what the city's defenses look like. Now this is the point where he is full-fledged, working as part of the intelligence community of the United States. By this point, he is definitely a spy. But think of how his earlier life had led him to this point. First of all, and here's where his sense of Jewishness really begins to enter, because for him, he wasn't only fighting as an American. Like other American Jewish soldiers who volunteered and enlisted, he was fighting a war against fascism, and even though he was fighting in Japan, at least for part of the war, if you're fighting an ally of Hitler, you are fighting against Hitler. It was very personal to him. He was fighting on behalf of Jews who were being persecuted by Hitler. When he was in Japan, certainly. And then later in the war, his other main intelligence mission, he was sent to Europe to secure, also using his background in languages. He spoke German fluently. He was sent to Europe to to try to find information about how much is Germany developing an atomic bomb, the atomic energy program in Germany during the war. They wanted him to find out about Heisinger and other scientists. Now, how impactful this was, well, again, this is something that historians love to debate. So, for example, what he did in Japan, some of his biographers, let's call them the more generous ones, the ones who are really, let's just say, automatically praising him, will say that the photographs he took of Tokyo really laid the basis for the United States, the American aerial invasion of Tokyo and other parts of Japan. They were instrumental. Now we do know that he showed those photos to a leading officer, Doolittle, who was the one who organized it. We don't know how pivotal it was. We don't know, would the attack, the invasion have not been as successful without those photographs? We don't know, but we certainly know that he was working toward this cause and he was trying to help. Okay? I think at this point it's worth pausing for a moment just to give a sense of just to give a sense of how he was regarded by people. You know, by 1940, what did people think of him? What was his reputation in America? And certainly, you know, how he understood himself. So, if you look at your handout, I brought two things we can read. First, look, I thought it would be interesting, especially since, you know, the Detroit Jewish News and the Jewish Chronicle has all been digitized. You can go online and read the whole thing. What did the Detroit Jewish Chronicle report about Mo Berg? In other words, this is a way of saying that what did ordinary Jews like us in Detroit, what did they know about Mo Berg? So was there a story about him in the Jewish Chronicle, the precursor to the Jewish News? And of course, and yes, there was. Look at text number 1. This is from a story of the Detroit Jewish Chronicle, April of 1931. So this is the point where he has begun to establish himself as a Major League Baseball player. At this point, there weren't that many major Jewish ball players at all. You know, this is before there was Al Rosen. This is a decade or two before. So this is what the Jewish Chronicle said. Quote, Chicago, the second largest Jewish community in America, has 2 major league teams, but only one of them has a Jewish player, Mo Berg, the scholar of the big leagues. He's already known as the Major League Baseball player who not only went to college, but who graduated from college and has a really good mind in addition to being a ball player. Berg, a Princeton graduate, master of half a dozen languages, see in 1931 it's still only half a dozen languages, came right from college to professional baseball. He tried playing the infield for a while, but later became a catcher. And as the backstop of the Chicago White Sox, that means the catcher, the American League team, he is now a regular, his throwing and hitting have raised him to the level of the best catchers in the game. Now, I have to say that last phrase, that's a little bit hyperbole. There were better catchers in baseball in 1931. But of course, from the vantage point of the Detroit Jewish Chronicle, they're not looking for objective news reporting. This is one of the only Jewish ball players, and if he's there and he plays catcher, he's one of the best Jewish catchers in the game. This could have been written by his mother just as easily as whoever wrote it for the Jewish News. I think equally interesting, though, and what really gets to this whole notion of being a baseball player and a scholar, is Berg's own understanding of the game. He had a keen understanding of what baseball was and how it worked, and not just statistics and who won and who lost, but he was one of the first ball players who, when he wasn't playing in the game, actually reflected on what baseball was and what it meant to him. Most ball players really couldn't do this. So, in the Atlantic Monthly in 1941, he wrote an essay called Pitchers and Catchers. It's really him reflecting about baseball. Now, I put an excerpt here. If you want to, if you go, at home, if you Google Atlantic Monthly, Mo Berg, and this title, you can read the whole essay. It's a great read. It's a great read. But I just want to read you this one excerpt just to give you a sense that he wasn't only playing the game, he was contemplating the game as well. So this is what he writes in 1941, quote, "Baseball men agree with the philosopher that perfection, which means a pennant to them, is attainable only through a proper combination of opposites." So first let's pause and say how few, there's no way Babe Ruth is writing that sentence. Let's agree there that no, there's no way. First of all, there's no profanity in it. Secondly, let's just agree there, okay? A team equally strong on attack and defense, well proportioned as a unit with, of course, those intangibles, morale, enthusiasm, and direction,
That is the story of success in baseball. Good fielding and pitching without hitting, or vice versa, is like Ben Franklin's half pair of scissors, ineffectual. How many ball players could quote Poor Richard's Almanac and Socrates in the same paragraph? Okay. He makes a reference here to a player called Home Run Baker. At this point in the essay, he's looking back sort of on the development of the game. He's asking, until a certain point, there were very few home runs that were hit. Before Babe Ruth, there weren't a lot of home runs in the game. You know, players who played before Babe Ruth, like Ty Cobb, he barely hit 100 home runs. I think his whole career, he hit 118 home runs over 20 years. Babe Ruth was really the first big home run hitter. You know, first time Babe Ruth led the league in home runs, I think he hit maybe 20. Okay? So, and Berg is going to explain how the game went from having very, very few home runs into having lots and lots of home runs. Okay? Home Run Baker, who hit 2 balls out of the park in the 1911 World Series to win his nickname, and never more than 12 in a full season, which means he hit 12 home runs one season and was called Home Run Baker. Today that would be called someone who never hits rarely hits a home run. Characterizes the defensive era of the game. In other words, for a long time, the game was about defense, and you would get singles and not hit home runs, okay? But here he's going to explain what happened, why the game changed during World War I. This is one of the first attempts to really write what we might call the history of baseball, or the historical development of baseball. During the last war, which he means World War I, it was impossible to get some of the 9 foreign ingredients that enter into the manufacture of our baseball. To make up for the lack of the superior foreign yarn, our machines were adjusted to wind the domestic product tighter. In 1919, when the war was over, the foreign yarn was available, but the same machines were used. The improved technique, the foreign ingredients, Babe Ruth's bat, conspired to revolutionize baseball. In other words, the ball was made differently during and after the war because of the yarn and other ingredients that were available. And at around the same time, that's when Babe Ruth went from being a pitcher to a hitter, and that's when he started hitting home runs. Now, he wasn't saying that Babe Ruth wasn't a great hitter, but he said that Babe Ruth became a great hitter in Major League Baseball the same time when the ball, when it was hit, started traveling a lot farther because of the way it was made. Now, and if you're wondering, yes, he is the first and only person by 1941 to say that. There was no other analyst of the game. If you asked anyone else in the game why Babe Ruth was the first one to be able to hit 30, 40, 50, 60 home runs in a season, the answer would have been because he was Babe Ruth. He was just that good. And Mo Berg wasn't disputing that entirely, but he was just saying there's more to the story than Babe Ruth was a good hitter. One of the things he also points out elsewhere is, there was a hitter before Babe Ruth named Shoeless Joe Jackson. You probably know him. If you don't know him from baseball, you know him from the movie Field of Dreams, maybe. He held the bat just like Babe Ruth. He was just as strong and talented as Babe Ruth, but he hit far few home runs than Babe Ruth because he played earlier and he wasn't hitting that new ball that would just travel really far. Okay. Revolutionize baseball. Now, here, this is the line I love. This is him really talking about, almost in a philosophical way, about the development of baseball. It seems prophetic, with due respect to the Babe, that our great American national game, so native and representative, could have been so completely refashioned by happenings on the other side of the world. Baseball was transformed by the war in Europe and the lesser availability of foreign products to make baseballs. It wasn't just developing internally. The importance of the bat has been completely refashioned by happenings on the other side, has been stressed to such an extent that since 1920, foreign substances have been barred to the picture, and spitballs outlawed. The other thing that changed, he said, is that for a long time, the rules of the game favored pitchers over batters.
which means today there are certain pitches that are outlawed. You can't throw a spitball where you rub saliva on the ball, or you rub oil on the ball, or any kind of substance on the ball, which makes it easier to throw the ball harder and make it break more. You can throw a better curved ball with less effort if you put some of these things on the ball. Those things were all allowed to a certain point. But when the ball started traveling farther and the leaders of Major League Baseball, meaning the owners and the commissioner, realized how much the fans loved home runs, they would jump up and cheer home runs, and how more people were coming to the game to watch the ball leave the park rather than to watch a pitcher throw a really good game and strike everybody out. How much more exciting and dramatic that was. The rules were changed to favor hitters. This also happened when Babe Ruth was in the game. The rosin bag, the sole concession, is used on the hands only to counteract perspiration. Adaptability, now he's going to talk about what makes a good hitter a good hitter. Adaptability is the hallmark of the big league hitter. Joe Cronin, Hall of Famer, playing manager of the Red Sox, has changed in his brilliant career from a fastball left field pole hitter, apologies for the typos, to a curveball and right field hitter, to and fro through the whole cycle and back again, according to where the pitchers are throwing. A good hitter has to be able to adapt to what pitchers are doing. So pitchers are figuring out new ways to pitch. The skillful batters have to adapt. He, meaning Cronin, has no apparent weaknesses, hits to all fields, and is one of the greatest clutch hitters in the game. Plus ça change, plus ça la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Another phrase that Babe Ruth would never have used if he could write something. The players, and here he's going to conclude with really the mentality of the Major League Baseball player. The players are, and this is something I think that is different, the game that he knew earlier in the century and the game today. The players are not interested in the score, but merely in how many runs are necessary to tie and win. They take nothing for granted in baseball. The idea is to win. The game's the thing. He's basically saying players are not very interested in their own statistics. They don't care how many home runs they hit. All they want to do is win. And elsewhere in the essay, he comments, one of the things he's realizing is that there isn't a lot of money in the game. So there's that earning more money is not that much of a financial stake unless you can become Babe Ruth. Now, I think this is interesting for us because it shows this combination, this quintessential student athlete, this college grad who became a ball player. But an essay like this, if we're wondering how it is that an organization like the OSS would know to recruit someone like Mo Berg. Yes, they knew he'd been to Japan, and they knew he spoke the languages, but I think also very important is they read this and said, oh my God, there's a ball player who can do this. There's a ball player who can analyze, understand people, understand the intricacies and nuances of a situation this deeply. This guy's got it. We got to get this guy. And when he himself volunteered and wanted to serve his country, from the vantage point of the OSS, he was a perfect choice. His connections, his language, his ability to write, to express himself. Because remember, if you're in the intelligence, if you're a spy, it isn't just about being an effective spy. You have to be able to write an effective report. You have to be able to describe succinctly and clearly and analytically that which you have discovered. And if anyone read this, they would say, oh, wow, this guy, he didn't just play baseball. He understands baseball more than anyone else who's played baseball. He was unique. There were top-of-the-line sports writers by this point who wrote beautiful things about baseball. Really skilled things, but what they really weren't, they weren't sports writers who were also ball players. And they weren't ball players yet who became sports writers. Mo Berg was a real unique find in that way, and that dovetailed with his other abilities. And I think that's an important part of this path. College graduate, major league ball player, and ultimately part of the intelligence community as well. Okay? Now, when the war ended, what Mo Berg wanted to do at this point is he wanted to be transferred to Palestine, and then when Israel became a state, that's where he wanted to spend the latter part of his life. The government wasn't interested in doing it for a variety of reasons. One of them was it simply wasn't seen as being that diplomatically significant in the 1940s. Not yet. It would eventually. And so after the war, Mo Berg sort of wound up, in a kind of uncelebrated kind of way, bouncing from job to job. He never quite really fit in. He didn't really have what he couldn't play baseball anymore. And he didn't really have what it take to, wasn't interested in coaching. He wasn't interested in being a sports writer. In a way, his interests were so eclectic that he was being pulled simultaneously in different directions. But his achievements were eventually recognized when he was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman. Now, I should say that when he was awarded this medal, he didn't refuse it, but he said, whatever. He didn't even want to go to Washington to accept it. It just wasn't his style. He knew what he did. And he wasn't doing it for the accolades. But nonetheless, this is the commendation that President Truman gave or issued for Mo Berg after the war. This is text number 3. Mr. Morris Berg, United States civilian, rendered exceptionally meritorious service of high value to the war effort from April 1944 to January 1946. In a position of responsibility in the European theater, he exhibited analytical abilities and a keen planning mind. He inspired both respect and constant high level or endeavor on the part of his subordinates, which enabled his section to produce studies and analysis vital to the mounting of American operations. That's high praise. That's about the highest praise you can get for a spy. He did his job, he did it well, and he was commended for it. And that is the culmination of this career. So what do we really see ultimately in someone like Mo Berg? We see someone who started from typical, let's call it humble, immigrant American Jewish beginnings, who worked himself through his own abilities to become a university graduate and a lawyer, to graduate from an elite institution, to have a career in the major leagues, I think lifetime 243 hitter, okay, but to be regarded as a leading defensive player. He was someone who was well liked by other players. They didn't object to the fact that he was Jewish. Everybody knew it. He didn't seem to have much problem with it. And then finally, he culminated his own professional career by serving his country during World War II. So he was unusual in certain ways, but he's a kind of everyman of the American Jewish experience of the first half of the 20th century. He single-handedly, in his own life, he accomplished 3 of the major goals, or 3 of the major aspirations that really would drive or impel American Jews all over, of all kinds, of all sorts. He was able to do 3 things that few other American Jews were able to do in one lifetime. Thank you. Thank you very much.